Thanks, Joan. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. For those who are around the world and around our country, I'd love to know where you are. So would you mind throwing that in the chat? I'd love to be able to afterwards kind of see where everybody is. So here we go. So we have four goals today. It's broken into four parts. Introductions, a little bit about myself and to kind of speak to the mental model that I bring to the work. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the book and the work that goes into the book. Then, as you can see, I'm a devotee to the Water Center. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the tools that I've learned and how I've used them, and then trying to bring it all together. So here we go. So one of the first parts of human-centered leadership is to recognize the importance of the people in your system. And that's because in a human-centered model, it's about the people. People come first. And so, each of us is a result of someone else's decisions, and each of us has lived experiences that, we have thoughts and we make decisions based on those experiences. So for all of us who are experienced with the iceberg model, it's our mental models that form the way that we sort of see the world and how we behave. And so I'd like to start with my story, which is Across the Sea and Trailer Sea. And so there you go, a reference to one of our habits. You'll see those popping up from time to time because it truly has influenced a lot of the work that we do. So Across the Sea is that I'm the grandson of immigrants from Odessa, Ukraine. They were Ukrainian Jews who were living in these small shtetls, and my grandfather and my grandmother and all four of my grandparents got on boats and came to the United States. And truly, it's just thinking about their experiences and the sacrifices they made is a big part of who I am. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I took my children to the mouth of the Black Sea in Istanbul, Turkey, and I said, we're standing up on this bluff, and I'm pointing out I said, across this sea is where my grandfather, your great grandfather, got on a boat and with hopes and dreams of a better life. And can you believe it that 100 years later, we are standing on this bluff? And you can see in the photo, they're like, just take the picture. They didn't really care. However, I do believe that embedded in them, that experience will certainly impact and influence the way that they see the world and the decisions that they make. So I am from across the sea. I'm from immigrants, and I'm very aware of the risks that people take to get to a safe place, sanctuary, so that they can have a better life and make a better life for others in their care. So Trailer Sea is, as a teacher, I was confronted in Oakland, California with the stark differences between those with access and those without. And so, while I grew up in New York, I certainly became an adult in Oakland. And it was there that my moral focus, sort of this desire to end poverty, to impact and influence the lives of those around me, to share my blessings with others, really sort of fueled this compelling purpose that every action I took and every action I take is in pursuit of achieving that moral focus. So I'd love to introduce you to all these kids that were in my classroom, and maybe someday I will. But right now, I'd like to tell you about two. And so this is George. George is an interesting kid because it certainly fueled my interest in systems thinking. In fact, I wrote my dissertation about George and children like George, why children learn or don't learn English. And, George is a kid who started in an English-only classroom for kindergarten. His parents had wanted him to be in a Spanish bilingual class, but there was no room, so they chose English. They thought, well, why not? I mean, we want him to learn English, so we'll put him in English only. And then they worried that he wasn't speaking any Spanish at home, and so then for first grade, they put him in a Spanish bilingual classroom. And then they were concerned that he wasn't going to be learning English, so they moved him back to an English-only classroom for second grade. And then by the time I had him as a third grade teacher in Oakland, he was essentially alingual. Like, he could talk no problem about sports, about Pokemon, about Foursquare, but when it came to academic English, he really struggled. And same thing for academic Spanish. And so I started to think to myself, like, what is going on here? And it really was, there's the habit, in terms of how a system generates its behavior and gets the results it was created to get. And so I wrote my whole dissertation about these systems that were created that really served as obstacles to kids learning. So George is an important one. And then the other that sort of helps you understand a little bit more about my mental model is Isaac. And Isaac was, he was born in Mexico. His family, his mother paid for a coyote to smuggle them across the border to be reunited with their father in Oakland. So they get to Los Angeles, they take a bus up to Oakland, and they had this romanticized sort of ideal of what it's going to look like, and it was an absolute nightmare for them. In fact, every night he and his mother and his brother and their dog slept in a closet while their father played cards and drank. And you know, my father always said to me, we are lucky to whom we are born, right? And so if we are in this area or we have this privilege that we can do something about and help others, we should. And in fact, when our first child was born, we named him Isaac, in part so that we would never forget that we have a role and a duty as humans on this planet. So this work is so personal to me. And so you'll see these letters at the bottom of your screen, A, E, and O, and those really reference this. AEO means achievement, enrichment, and opposition, and opportunity. It speaks to access, truly. So achievement for me is that I want kids to have a great, a good curriculum, but I want them to have excellent teachers. And enrichment is I want them to have access to music and art and all the kinds of things that will inspire them to aspire. And opportunity is two things. One is I want to eliminate all barriers to enrichment, and I want to find better ways to access school. So I'm going to put the habit there. I try to make it an O to be clever. But truly, this idea that cause and effect. So, I want to have a thought when we think about opportunity about how do we eliminate the barriers to school. So discipline. We struggle a lot as an institution not having a shared image of what words mean. So things like defiant or disrespect, those really imperil schools because when we suspend a child for defiance, the child then misses school and then comes back to school having missed work, and then often acts up because they've missed important learning, and so then they're suspended again. So this terrible cycle. So I wanted to be a part of changing that, and so we put together lots of programs that I would love to tell you about, but I know we don't have time today. But I do want to tell you about one, and this is this last one that's on here. Whoops, which is Como Ed. And Como Ed, and I can almost use a stock flow map, so I'll throw it up there. In reference to some of the work we do at the Water Center. We wanted to increase our diversity when it came to our staffing. And so what we did was we said, okay, well, we can recruit teachers to come to mid-Missouri. That's where Columbia is located. It's a university town, wonderful place. However, we couldn't retain. And so when we started to think about this, we wanted to create a pipeline of locally educated, highly effective, and thanks to the Supreme Court, we won't say teachers of color, will say culturally competent teachers. So we wanted to kind of look at who are our students within our own system that could become teachers for us. And so in talking with local colleges, we were able to get full tuition paid, full room and board, a stipend, so that not only did they get to be on campus, but they would also feel like they belonged on campus. And so, we couldn't have done this had it not been for these types of programming. So that's who I am in terms of introduction. Now, an imperfect leader, human-centered leadership and after action, it's my hope and my promise in the webinar description that I would introduce you to a leadership model, and then we'll engage in some conversation here in a moment that will help you tackle difficult issues and then move you closer to where you want to be. So, schools, and this quote really it speaks to any organization. And it really speaks to the interconnectedness of our systems. So when it comes to schools or any organization, they are like an organism, and they grow and they stay healthy when you are engaged in this deep learning. And that can only happen if you are really thinking about, you can add facilities, you can add technology, you can, go rah in terms of enthusiasm, you can add more money, and those are short term in terms of having sort of what you want to achieve, but true growth and true progress happens when you're engaged in deeper learning. And so I had been a product of, there's a difference between reform and transformation. And I was really a product in Oakland of reform. this sort of what's not going well, what do we need to fix, and using coaching for compliance, and really maintaining just a lot of pressure on people to improve. And it was in this desire to learn a better way that I consciously began shifting from reform to transformation. And so transformation really is this collective aspiration. So, what is this shared purpose that we all want to create together? How do we really look at things with curiosity and through an appreciative lens, saying, um, what's going well and how do we get more of it? And we want to lead with questions. We want to continue to have cycles where we are saying what's working, and then if it's not going as we would want, where are those mid-course corrections? Or in terms of the habits of systems thinking cards, really looking at, are we getting to where we need to be? And then what kind of changes do we need to make? And that the coaching is peer coaching, that we are lifting each other up. And then sometimes we recognize that maybe the goal we had originally set needs to change. And so it was in that sort of interest, right? I mean, doesn't that sound better in terms of what you're trying to achieve for your organization? For me, it was in this model that I found that. So transformation. And so I'm going to explain a little bit about this model for human-centered school transformation. It's broken into 3 dimensions: collective aspiration, nested patterns, and leaders learning work. And at the center is this culture of deep learning. So first and foremost, again, it's a human-centered model. And that really speaks to, wanting to transform schools for children, and that it's really about focusing on the people. And when I say children, I intentionally avoid using the word students. I say it from time to time, but I try to focus on kids or children. Some say scholars, and that's because each of our kids are individuals with their own hopes and dreams. And when we say students, it sort of harkens back to the original model of schools developed by Frederick Taylor. And that's, the only 2 institutions that are still using that model of efficiency are prisons and schools. Yikes. So deeper learning really speaks to this, that we're grounded in authentic, real work, and that we're, involving students and their interests and really looking at their communities. And deeper learning is relevant learning. And whether you're in a school setting right now, a nonprofit, whether you're in other industries, you can absolutely apply this sort of thinking about deep learning within your own organization and consider your role as an activator. In schools, we say it's the teacher's role as an activator for this deeper learning, and it's a leader's role as well. And so we then get to this point where, more than anything, deeper learning gets to Peter Senge's 2 questions. What do we want to create together? And how do we want to be together? So collective aspiration is where we start. And deeper learning requires this different way of leading. For one, the model calls for this collective aspiration, and it's the heart of the work that we do. It asks you to declare where we're headed, like what you believe, both individually and collectively, and there's a working assumption. And before I share that working assumption, there are these 5 aspects to it. And you've heard me reference it a little bit earlier. Moral focus is kind of like your vision. Compelling purpose is sort of like your mission. What are the actions that we're taking to get there? Shared images of success. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to unmute and share, how do you do that in your own organization? How do you find that you are making sure that what you're working on has a shared understanding? An ethic of excellence speaks to not ethics, but an ethos, a looking at the stages and the progress that one makes to get to that final result. A good example would be when you walk into a building, whether or not you see a bulletin board in a school building. And does it just have the final product that says, look what we made? Or does it really reference the different stages to get, those different iterations to get to where you want it to be? And then positive connectedness, and I think Zach Taylor is on our call today. He wrote a marvelous monograph about positive connectedness, that psychological safety that we try to create. And so the working assumption here for collective aspiration is it's more about that internal accountability and collective aspiration. What are we trying to achieve together, right? In like that you saw in that transformation guide, as opposed to that reform sort of element of having someone externally tell you whether or not you're achieving. And it gets all the way down to, right, we need to create those conditions for psychological safety, for that positive connectedness. And that really speaks to that mental model. And so in a moment, I'll also share a little bit of the iceberg. But for me, it was trailer C and across the sea, right? Looking at those mental models. So I'd like to make a connection together, and I'd like to open this up for your conversation. And I want you to think about your own professional and your own personal situation. What advice, or what might be some ways that you make sure that there is a shared image of success in your organization? And for an example, you could use sort of the stock flow. So the stock here is that we're trying to maybe increase morale. So is there a shared image of what morale even means? Or decrease burnout? So what does that mean, burnout? When you hear that phrase, is there a shared image? Or for me, it's I always hear about engagement, student engagement, teacher engagement, parent engagement, or if you're in an industry that is not schools, client engagement. How do we engage? What does that even mean? So I'm curious, if you don't mind, we'll take a moment. I'd love to hear what are some ways that you make sure that there's a shared image of success in the work that you do?
I could go, Peter. This is Zach.
Hey, Zach, thanks.
Sure. I'm thinking of a couple things as you talk about this, and one is I help schools create project-based learning in their schools, and people have all sorts of different ideas about what project-based learning is and what good project-based learning is, um, and we try to create like a shared image of success about what they want to see, whether it's place-based learning or how at what level is it engaging students, is it what level is it connected to deeper learning, and so just came to mind as you were saying about a shared image of good project-based learning.
Thanks, Zach. I really appreciate that connection. It is true that often, particularly with like project-based learning, that there's this idea that it's a lot of activities or it's a lot of field trips, as opposed to that sort of deep learning about your community and the questions you might have within it, and then working on projects that sort of achieve that. There's a really good example, I think, in the schools that I know that you've worked with in Penasco outside of Santa Fe, that have really done some deep work around that. Thanks. What are some other ways that people have used this idea, or now that you've even heard the word or the term shared image, that you might want to go back and say, man, I can't wait to go back to my to my office or to the people I work with to really make sure that we have this shared idea of what we're trying to achieve.
David has his hand raised, and then Mary.
Perfect. I'm assuming, Joan, that you're going to call on people, or they will just unmute themselves. Yeah.
David, I call on you, and then Mary.
Ooh, the power of the host.
Hello, everyone. Um, in my work, it is very important to, as we say, zoom in and zoom out constantly with our teachers, and that makes reference to one of the habits, which is seeking to understand the big picture, which is very, very important. So our teachers don't feel that they are just doing their own thing in their classroom and it's not contributing to a bigger purpose. So in doing that, we make sure that this image of where we want to go, what we want to accomplish, be it the big intents in our strategic plan, for example, is really clear to everyone, and we constantly help people make connections between what they do and this compelling purpose. And so another habit that is related to that is changing perspectives to increase understanding. So we make sure that everyone's perspective is considered, and as we share those perspectives, we enrich our big picture. So that's something that we do. Thank you.
David, where are you located?
I'm in Cali, Colombia, Colegio
Fantastic.
Bolívar, which is a bilingual international school.
How cool. Well, I appreciate that perspective, and that it made me think of the metaphor of uh, being in the balcony watching a dance performance. So there are those who, when you zoom out, you're in the balcony being able to watch a magnificent dance. And then when you're zooming in, you're a dancer on the dance floor, and you don't always get to see the choreography and how it was established when you're on the dance floor. But when you zoom out, you can be like, oh man, that isn't going as well. It's clear we don't have a shared image there. So thanks, David. And Joan, who was the one more? And then we'll move. We'll go.
Okay, so one more would be Mary Boulay.
Hi, Dave.
Hi, Mary.
Hi, Peter. I'm in Tucson. What came to mind was it's more of a strategy, more of a granular thing, but you mentioned earlier the idea of how language, it can be so, it's such an important part of this image of shared success. And it brought to mind the idea of denominalizing words, that idea of taking a word like disrespect and as a group really breaking down some of this language so that you literally write down what do you see and hear, because the words are nouns, but they're actually not nouns, they're processes. And so sometimes getting that granular clarity on what the words mean that we're using together can contribute to a bigger ecosystem or system of shared success.
I love that, Mary. I mean, thinking about the fact that we make decisions based on our understanding of a certain word. If we don't have that shared image, then we're potentially really moving in a very different direction than what was maybe our original intent. Thanks so much. Wow. So the next in the model, there's this dimension of nested patterns, and that really speaks to the positive behavior that everybody practices. And nested patterns is really the muscle of the work. And we hope that it's, almost like those Russian nesting dolls, that it's like at the core, it is everything that we do. We get this muscle memory of how we behave. And there are 5 aspects to this as well. And so 2 I will point out is framed in this working assumption. So this working assumption of distributed leadership is critical to the complex work of human-centered transformation. And so like distributed leadership is critical to the complex work, right? And so that speaks to high levels of collaboration and shared leadership. And then a third I would mention, because it refers to 2 habits of systems thinking, which is changing perspectives to increase understanding. So David, you mentioned that earlier, and I see it totally appropriate there and here as well. And then surfaces and test assumptions. Like the card actually encourages you to do this, ideally with others. And that's practicing, I think, a growth mindset, which is to like challenge the things that you believe to be indisputable, irrefutable. And so I'd like to share, or at least ask to make some more connections. So I'm hoping that we'll continue this dialogue and hear what others are thinking. And so this is what I'd like you to consider. What are ways that you include multiple perspectives in decision making? What have you found to work in your work with others? Many of you are coaches, and so you've got to take in a lot of input as you then collectively create something together. And I'm curious, what are some ways that you do that?
We have a hand raised. I don't know who the person is, but it's ISS office.
So sorry about the ISS office. I don't know how to change that. My name is Michelle Friend. I'm from the International Society for System Science. That's why I have that.
I'm so glad it wasn't in school suspension.
I wouldn't even know what that means. But what I do to include other people is that in our projects, we listen very carefully to what everyone has to say. And we take note about what everyone has to say, and we regard what they have to say as information, and we decide how important that is. But it's a very inclusive system. And in particular, we seek out the voices of people who are less often heard and encourage them to speak and make sure that it's a safe environment to speak.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
So what does that look like? Is that where you have butcher paper up and you're writing down, what people are saying, and you're checking to see, if people are saying similar things, or, what are some ways that you are really, you say, essentially what you're saying is we make decisions with the people most impacted. So we want to include all voices. And I'm curious, what might be some techniques or strategies that you could share with the rest of us where you've found success?
So what we do as a group is that I'll assign some of we go and visit different communities,
Mm.
And some of the people are what I call the data scientists for the day, and they're in charge of taking down notes, very, very careful notes about everything that's said. We then then we meet in the evenings as a group, not with the people that we were talking to, but as scientists, and we discuss each of the data points, and we discuss them in two terms. I don't want to go at too much length, but in two terms. One is qualitative, whether it's
Yep.
harmonious, exciting, or discipline and difficulties, and then how important it is. And then then I wave some mathematical magic wands, and from the whole conversation, each of those data points then gets merged into one indicator on what I call an institutional compass. So there'll be an overall direction, qualitative direction, say in harmony, or in discipline, or in excitement, and it will have a length which gives you the importance.
I love that. Oh, at some point I'm going to want to connect with you because many of us work and facilitate conversations with communities, and being able to both balance that qualitative piece and making sure that as the individual sort of engaging in looking for themes, that it is multiple perspectives doing that as well, so that it's not a single point of success or failure based on looking at that. So thanks for sharing that. Were there any others, Joan?
Yes, Anne Gallagher has her hand raised, and then there was also a comment in chat.
Okay.
Hey, Peter. Anyway, so a couple things that I've done in working with schools to really get multiple perspectives. One is we really brought together students and their families who were really struggling with school and least successful and just had a lot of barriers to or challenges in their lives. And we just had a lunch and we brought everyone around and we just had kind of some open-ended questions and gave an opportunity for families and students to share. Predominantly they were spoke Spanish, so we made sure we had someone who was fluent in Spanish in each of the tables, and it was just a lovely way to hear from students and student perspectives. And another just real practical thing I'm working on is we're trying to do some standards-based report card. And so something we're going to be doing is doing a focus group and just inviting particularly our families and particularly our families of color to come together and look at that and give us feedback. And does it make sense? Is it in family-friendly language? So really taking those opportunities to not just push forward, but to slow down and really hear from, the people that were there before.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anne. And it's a nice segue to this next dimension, which is the leaders learning work, because there's an aspect in there of the 5 aspects, the using the power of language. And you use the term "doesn't make sense," which is a very disarming sort of phrase, as opposed to "do you agree," which is high stakes, because depending on there are some who believe they have to say yes, because you're the authority of the schools. And does it make sense is sort of this way of allowing someone to say, no, it doesn't make sense, or could you tell me a little bit more, or things like that. So using the power of language. And so this last dimension, the leaders learning work, really it's the mind and the brains of the work that we do. And it has these 5 aspects. And that first one, serving as a lead learner, has everything to do with this working assumption. One of a leader's most important roles is to nurture that rich cultural field that supports learning for every person in the school system. And that whether you walk into a doctor's office, auto body shop, your own offices, and particularly in schools, whether or not you are honored and valued, whether kids or children are valued and honored, right? It says there's a banner that says, "We're glad that you're here." Or is it the kind of like when you walk into the building and it says like, don't take one more step before you need to sign in, right? And don't forget to get a visitor badge and all those sort of like, that's the cultural field that you start to feel. So as a leader, we can do this by supporting our people. And so, I think of all of the habits, and I know in my spotlight that I didn't choose this one, but truly, as I started to think about this even more, it was this as a leader that really has helped me become a better better leader. And that's the fact that we need to consider those short-term, those long-term, and those unintended consequences of any of our decisions or actions. And so, and I started to be able to do that better. And so my last sort of making connection and asking for your feedback, or does it make sense, is, what are some other habits of systems thinking cards that might align with these 5 areas? And while I quickly describe them, if you have your camera, your phone, you want to select that QR code, it'll take you there. I can also quickly just throw it into the chat if you'd like to look at them, because those are really helpful. And I use them all the time with clients that I'm coaching. But serving as a lead learner says, I'm willing to admit when I've made a mistake. I'm willing to be vulnerable. And I'm also willing and insist that I learn alongside others. Supporting resilience is that idea that, we get knocked down, we get back up, right? That sort of that productive struggle. Using the power of language speaks to using metaphor and story and framing. So I love the archetypes that come from the Water Center. Things like accidental adversaries is one that I have certainly experienced. But that sort of that framing to then be able to diagram and map out what we're experiencing. Harvesting collective wisdom speaks to that really inside the system and outside the system, really looking and listening and learning from the people we work with. And then that last one has everything to do with why we're here, is applying systems and design thinking. So I'm curious, did any of the systems thinking cards sort of jump out at you as you were hearing that?
Devesh, I know you had your hand raised from before, but I want to let you have the
Yeah, please.
first voice if you still, have a thought to share now.
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, my name is Devesh Tahali. I work in healthcare and worked in pediatrics as well as now in adult healthcare. One of the things that I lend to the organizations and team members I work with is a system thinking lens. And a couple examples, one actually related to your previous question. And I think one of the things we kind of created as a mantra was, consciously making an effort to involve patients within the care protocols that we have, which traditionally has always been sort of unidirectional. And one of the things we used was nothing about me without me, and so that has caught a lot of steam with regard to how we design processes and involving and engaging patients. One such example was there used to be a booklet for bowel management program, and for decades it was designed without really any consideration of what were the practical situations, barriers that patients and families faced while using these brochures or booklets. And so a redesign of that with the patient's perspective, I think, has been greatly beneficial in terms of creating a better product that would be embraced and better utilized by the people that it was meant for. And so that was one example of that. And then as far as the cards are concerned, I would say the changes over time are some of the most important things that we look for with regard to what we're trying to do so that outcomes actually improve. And when we make changes to our system, we typically use statistical process control charts, which are specifically designed around detecting that special cause so that we know that the system has changed and you're not fooling yourself by simply reacting to a couple of data points that might otherwise lead you to conclude as to whether there was an improvement. So changes over time, very widely used in healthcare.
I love that. Yeah, change over time. I'm going to share 4 that came to mind for me, and that absolutely should have been the 5th as well. And I love this. Nothing about me without me, right? So that's, talk about harvesting collective wisdom, or really making decisions with the people most impacted. And as a school leader, it's very similar to being a hospital administrator or a leader within a hospital, working whether it's pediatrics or with adult patients, is that the idea that we make decisions hierarchically, we've made decisions without even considering their needs, their wishes, their wants. So thank you for that reminder. Super powerful. Joan, I'm going to move on unless there's any others that we're raising or ready to
I don't
go.
see any hand raised, so go for it.
Okay, so here are some that came to mind for me. So to some degree, I think serving as a lead learner also recognizes, like, when I make decisions that there are time delays, and being, responsible to working with others to manage that tension when there is a delay between when we make a decision and what we hope to be the results. I also think that successive approximation is one in terms of supporting resilience. It's like, look, are we where we want to be yet? And if not, what are some changes we need to make? Certainly harvesting collective wisdom. I mean, this card in particular, making those meaningful connections within and between systems. And then lastly, just, in any of the work that we're doing, any of the cards obviously apply to systems thinking and design thinking. So, okay. So all in all, I mean, I told you about AEO. And I shared with you this idea that organizations are an organism that are constantly alive and growing. That really transformation is the way to go. That there is a model that exists to replace what for me was sort of blind intuition, sort of saying like, I make good decisions for the most part, and sometimes I look back and go like, oh, that was not a good decision, or that was a good decision, and making it so that I'm more predictably making good decisions and helping others do that as well. That I'm anchoring the way that I see the world when I work with teams or with individuals to say, so what is it that we want to create together? And then also, how do we want to be together? What are those nested patterns? And, really the Water Center provides such impactful tools to help make sense of your past decisions as well as you're planning for the future. And it really all came together in this book. And I'm grateful to Tracy and Sherry and the entire organization for allowing me to include those habits of systems thinking cards within the book, and including some of the questions that come from the back of those cards, because I tackle themes like establishing values within your organization, or how do you set goals? How do you have conversations around race and class within your organization? Really difficult topics to discuss. The difference between a smart and a healthy team, and that comes from Patrick Lencioni's work, or shared images of success. We're there, and certainly the pandemic. So if anyone's interested to know about a superintendent's experience during the pandemic, give a look. And in the book, every chapter is a series of after action reviews. So, I think Devesh is probably really familiar because, it's the military and hospitals that do after action reviews most often. And I really would argue that schools and other institutions should be doing them as well. Looking at what got overlooked, what'd you learn about relationships, what frustrated you, what could you have done differently? And in the end, what was something that was good that came out of the experience? Because as lead learners, we use our experiences to help fuel better decisions in the future. And sometimes really good things happen. So Water Center, where have you been my whole life, right? It took me a while, but every single day I'm grateful to the Water Center. And I joked with Joan as we were talking before today. I said, sometimes I say if it were a religion, I might consider conversion because I really believe that this work has helped me become a better person. And so we started our work, our cohort started with Sherry kicked us off, and then we started working with Tracy, and the work has just been so amazing. And this was a quote from Danella Meadows that Tracy shared with us, which was, getting the beat on an institution or an organization. And so that before you disturb the system in any way, like watch how it behaves, learn its history. And if possible, make a graph of actual data from the system. So I'm going to share a few here. I started making small changes at first, getting the beat of the system, right? For example, finding ways to better build relationships within and between systems. And so what you see here is a timeline that really helped a school district begin seeing a change, or how they could approach change with their school boards. And in fact, it helped establish really clear parameters from when they were introducing programs or innovations. And so you'll see actually that there are questions directly from these cards. And this is this idea of, your board sits within your system and it represents the external system as well. And you're often trying to bring things to them. And there is a a heartbeat. There's sort of a way that you approach your system, and sometimes when we bring things at the wrong time, it absolutely we don't. There are consequences that we had just not expected to happen. And so there are, though, questions that we ask now when I'm working with a school superintendent about things that they might want to change. You know, so what does this look like a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now? What might the impact be on other programs? And the same thing if you're representing a different organization here today, right? How might the research and development department, right, see a decrease in their budget because you've moved it over to marketing? So really understanding those connections between how this decision might impact other programs. So it was my introduction to the Water Center, though, that I began to make sense of these patterns of behavior. And so we started to work. I was working with a school district about, and they were complaining about the fact that they were hiring teachers really at the last minute, and they really felt like they weren't getting the very best teachers. And so, you know, you can dialogue about that, but there's such power in putting it down and actually designing and showing this behavior over time graph. And so we started to look at this, right? Really understanding that a system structure generates its behavior. And so you see the x-axis, right, in terms of September through June, that's time. And then on the y-axis is the first graph I'm going to share with you, which was teacher resignations. So in September, this district would have some resignations, some people who had an illness in the family or were being relocated, their spouse was being relocated, so they had to leave. And then the district knew that people were leaving because people would tell them in December. There was an incentive for telling them early. And then they would hear more in March and in June that people were leaving. And so that was fine. So we marked that off. We charted that off together. And then I said, well, now tell me about your hiring practices. Let's look at the same graph, you know, September through June, and when you actually begin hiring people. Well, you'll notice something here. In September, some of those people who leave, they hire them, you know, very quickly. So that made sense. They start to learn about people leaving in December, and yet there's not much new hiring going on. In February, they have a job fair towards the end of that month, and still they are thinking about hiring. And then March comes and they begin hiring. And then in June, they're hiring all the way into the summer. And in fact, even after school starts. So we put those two graphs side by side. And so using the chat, if you don't mind, what do you notice is the problem here between when they know about resignations and when they actually begin hiring? So I'm going to look in the chat and just kind of see what you notice. Yeah, Michelle, exactly. Don, right on. So I'm sure many of you are like, yeah, I see it, the time delay. And it has everything to do with the fact that all these other districts were getting what they believed the best candidates because so many of them were hiring earlier. And so I started to think about this from this perspective of, and many of you are familiar with the iceberg, right? It was the behavior over time graphs that really sort of helped me begin to see that there are, you know, to observe these patterns that are happening. So, you know, above the water, we know on this iceberg model is all the things that are happening, right? What's visible. And below that iceberg, below the water, sorry, not below the iceberg, below the water, is where we begin understanding where our leverage points might be or what we've learned about our system so that we can make appropriate changes. And so I'm going to give you an example of one that impacts lots of organizations, schools, and other institutions. So I was working with a client recently who was sort of lamenting that there were a number of employees who were coming in late all the time. And so that's something you could observe, right? And so when you look closely, they could see this sort of pattern of behavior. So they were seeing this trend of employees that were either habitually late or even not even showing up for work. And so I started to share with him just a little bit more about the structure of the system, looking at this from like going deeper into this iceberg model to say, okay, what is it that might be causing these patterns to exist? And I even broke it down to share with him sort of the physical, environmental, and ritual pieces that are there. So physical meaning like access to buses or reliable transportation, or when they arrive, there's only one entrance for a certain class of employee, and there's this really long line to get through security. That was one of his observations. It could also be that maybe for the employee that there are family and close friends that they rely on to take care of their child, or that they are being the caretaker for other people's children, and that's causing issues. Or ritual that, when it gets cold, it may be difficult to get everyone out of the house. Or even like a cultural ritual in that prayer schedule is dictated by certain hours, and that makes it difficult to make all the connections. And so that was kind of interesting, because then we moved down to this, understanding that, particularly with the entrance piece, that the structure dictates its behavior, but that the core reason that some of these things happen. So from the employee's perspective, in terms of beliefs, principles, and personal values, that, recognizing the core reason why any of these things happen starts with these mental models. And for the employee, it may be these strong, deeply rooted beliefs that really explain behavior. And for the employer, so the person I was coaching, it was that this person is the child of his father was in the military, so he was never late for anything. So this really impacts the way that he sees the world. And so if we have time, I'd love to return to this because I'm kind of curious how others have used the iceberg model to make sense of a situation. So we'll come back to that later. But certainly understanding the perspectives that people bring to the work impact and influence the events that happen. And so lastly, just wanting to try to bring this all together, because I coach leaders in education and in other fields, and I always like to sort of help them sort of try to start applying particularly the habits of systems thinking. So again, the link to the habits cards are still in the chat, or you can use the QR code there. But this is a protocol that recognizes that we're all part of a system, and that we are only successful when we're working together. So there's one more assumption from the model, and that's that we must draw upon the wisdom of the entire organization to transform our school district, our school, or whatever institution that we represent, and that it's a team, not a hierarchy. So I'll use Devesh's quote in terms of nothing about me without me. And so the look, listen, learn, lead protocol, to me, has been probably the most important process that I've used, because if any of you are in leadership, particularly if you walk into the room and you're the person that makes the final decision, that sometimes when there's an issue, you will suggest something, and then that just becomes what's going to be the process. And that's really frustrating, because what you're trying to do is harvest the collective wisdom of the people in the room. And so look, listen, learn, lead is a very simple protocol. It says, look. So for example, it may be, look, we've got chronic absenteeism in our organization, and I want to talk about that today. That's look. It's just making a statement about what is the problem. Or look, we've got departmental drama, right? The design team, it takes them 10 times to get us the materials before we get to what we're actually trying to put out there from marketing. Or look, we've got this hierarchical conflict because our senior leaders are don't understand why our rank and file are considering informational picketing or going on strike altogether. And so, look, I've got this problem. Now, listen is this next stage. And listen just says, the person who brought the look says, okay, I'm going to tell you everything that's going on and what I have tried to do and what I think might be the next answer. Now, if you don't have this kind of protocol, sometimes that's where it ends and people say, okay, it sounds like you've made a decision. But all you're saying is, look, here's the problem, and listen, I'm going to tell you all about it. And then the learn stage is really where the dialogue happens. And it's so exciting because you get to apply and use these cards. You get to say things like, you get to ask 1,000 questions. You get to say, so what are the systems that we're dealing with, and how are they connected to each other? How might this decision impact other departments? Or how do we make sure that we're considering this issue fully before we make a decision? Or have we considered the short term and long term and the unintended consequences of the decisions we're making? Have we been here before? And what have we done in the past, and how has that informed the way that things have gone? And is it a result of where we are today because of those past decisions? So, what are some, assumptions and our past experiences that could help? David mentioned this earlier. So, how do we, sort of zoom out to see the whole picture, and then how do we zoom in to understand what this one issue that you're trying to resolve, and then zoom back out, how it might impact, similar to the connections piece. And then lastly is sort of, how have we changed our perspective to increase understanding for others? And then you get to lead, and lead is everything from how are we going to communicate this to others? Have you been a part of an organization where they make a decision, but don't actually like tell anyone that they've made that decision? And so it's like, oh, so we're doing that now. And so, look, listen, learn, and then how are we going to communicate this? And sometimes with the lead is who's going to take the lead to go get additional information to bring back to the team. So look, listen, learn, lead to me is such an important way of really breaking down decision making as a protocol. And so I'm curious. I know we have about 5 minutes left, but I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on look, listen, learn, lead, or what are some ways that you make decisions with your own teams to make sure that you're doing everything that people have already stated, that you're including and making it inclusive, particularly for individuals who are on your team who may represent underrepresented groups within your organization, to really highlight and elevate their voice as well. What are some ways that you have incorporated these types of protocols?
Peter, this is Danelle from the Water Center.
Hi.
One of the things that we really love and we've used with our teacher leaders over the years is the 5 essential questions from Dean James Ryan's comment address that
talk about
fit
that
nicely with this, right? Like, wait, what is like the look part where you're getting into that? And I wonder why, or I wonder if is that learning part and listening, and couldn't we at least, and how can I help? And then what truly matters to people behind all of that. And so I just was struck by how much it follows that, which I love a lot, and I think drives a lot of what we do.
Thank you so much. I bet in so many ways it allows you to then facilitate good conversation as opposed to being looked at as the authority on where individuals should go, right? It really sort of opens up conversation as opposed to closing it out.
Danelle, could you put that reference in the chat, please?
Yeah, I'll drop in a graphic we have on it.
Lovely, thank you. And Don has his hand raised, Peter.
Oh, great, Don.
Yeah, so it's for me, it's not just about having this structure, the 4 L's or whatever, but it's actually building in the structure that gives you the intention of actually doing it, right? So like when I was leading software teams, right, we were doing agile development, and there's every 2 weeks there's a reflection and retrospective meeting where we literally sat down for 2 hours and just talked about what worked, what didn't work, and having that structure built into the schedule to actually do that kind of engagement. So
Don, as someone who does design thinking and diagramming, I imagine that the look, listen, learn, lead protocol, or the 5 whys that was brought up earlier, that as people are talking, you'd be in a position to be able to sort of begin diagramming this out, where you're getting stuck, how whether it's a stock flow or whether it's an archetype that you're trying to sort of understand, to sort of diagram and draw what people are saying to see if it somehow if it reflects what you hear is what you see. Does that make sense in terms of like how you can almost see where in the system people are getting stuck and where there might be opportunities or leverage points?
Yeah, I would say I didn't have those tools at the time. I would probably do more now. So
yeah. I mean, to me, it seems like a really great way to then begin in front of a whiteboard with your team, like, okay, this is what I hear you saying, and then looking at where those things connect, who they connect with, and where there might be issues or opportunities. Yeah.
Right.
So, Joan, thanks, Danelle, for putting that in there, the 5 essentials. So this is me. If I'd love for you to read the book, I'd love for you to listen in on the podcast. I interview superintendents across the country and ask them to deconstruct a decision they had to make. And I just love the work that we've been doing, and super excited that I was given this opportunity today. So, Tracy and Sherry, and thank you so much for the invitation. Certainly open to questions, but I know, Joan, that you have something you wanted to also share.
That's right, Peter. Thank you. Just wanted to let people know that next month, the Open Studio, same time, same place, same bat channel, is going to be igniting a fire, lighting the spark of systems thinking. People often ask, how do you get started? How do you, light that fire? Not only in yourself, but in others. So if you're working in an organization, you're here because you already know about systems thinking. You're hopefully excited about systems thinking. But, as a leader, you may want to bring others along with systems thinking. So next month's Open Studio session will give you ideas. And we're also going to hear from various people who have had the fire started, and we'll talk about how they have applied systems thinking in different fields. And some of them got started very young. We're going to have one gentleman who got started when he was in middle school. And so that'll be a whole different perspective. So anyway, that'll be next month. And Peter, just thank you so much. You just shared so much in this hour, and allowed people and allowed people to share from their perspectives. And so it was just a wonderful opportunity that you gave all of us to hear from you and then to hear from each other. So thank you.
Joan, you are so
much.
sweet. I laughed a big laugh because when about 2 weeks ago, when we were just sort of talking through and I was sharing with you some slides, there's a lot that was taken out because you were like, oh my. So I really thank you for your guidance, support, and trust. I really appreciate it.
Yes. Let me tell you, folks, you should join Peter's podcast because there's so much more that he has to share and that he can share in the podcast.
Yeah, you're all lucky. Otherwise, you were all going to need neck braces and like Dramamine because there's going to be like slide.
Yes, we had fun. And yes, Tracy is holding up the book. Yeah, and Tracy has the book and has worked with Peter extensively. So it's the top of the hour now. Thank you all for
Thanks,
joining
everyone.
us. And again,
Thanks.
thank you again, Peter. So see you on a future Open Studio session, folks. Thanks for being here. Bye-bye.
Thanks.